Hey, welcome back everybody. This is part 2 in this ASP.NET Core MVC series, and we're just working through a tutorial here building out a simple CRUD application. So CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. It allows us to do all 4 of those actions on a specific resource. So in this case, we're building a movie application or a movie app, and we're able to create textual information about a movie. So the title, maybe the rating, things like that. And then we can edit that information, and we can update it, and we can delete it if we want to. So previously we discussed controllers and adding a view, and now we're still on adding a view, but we're talking about passing data from the controller to the view. So our application from our last session, I believe it's still running in the browser for me. So here we are, we've got our home page, which is just the default welcome page for MVC, or for ASP.NET rather. And so then if we go to this route /hello world, then we get the index action or method for our hello world controller, which renders out this index template or view. And so it just has a title here and a subtitle. Now we do have the other action, so we could put /welcome, and this one, all it does is it looks for a parameter for the name in the URL and then a query string parameter for the ID. If neither of those are provided, or I might have that reversed, it might be the ID as a parameter and the name as the query string. Anyway, we'll see that in a second, but if either of those are missing, the name will be empty and then ID will just default to 1. So if we put another / and here we put some numeric value like 3 for instance, and then we use the question mark name is equal to some name, it'll pull name from the query string and it'll pull the number from after the / and it'll input them into this string. So we want to do more than that, and that's what we're going to do in this video. I think we're actually going to get into the model side of things, connecting a database, scaffolding, a full CRUD set of methods or actions in this controller. We'll probably create a new controller. Most of the heavy lifting is going to be done for us. We just have to make sure that we install the correct packages and then run the correct commands. So let's get into it. All right, so here we are at passing data from the controller to the view, and it's telling us that controller actions are invoked in response to an incoming URL request. The controller class is where the code is written that handles the incoming browser requests. It's kind of repetitive. The controller retrieves data from a data source and decides what type of response to send back to the browser. View templates can be used from a controller to generate and format an HTML response to the browser. So all this means is that we have requests coming in to our application from out there on the internet. Someone's on their computer and they go to our website.com, that's a request. They're on our website, they fill out a form and they click submit, that's another request. So there's information that's being provided with those requests, and it's coming into our application and it's being routed to a specific area, a specific function or method within our application that then knows how to pick apart the information that's been sent in that request and utilize it to send back a specific response. Sometimes that's going to be in the form of HTML, and they do that by interacting with what they call the view layer. They get a template, they might inject some dynamic data into it, some data that they pulled from the database, and then send back that HTML as a string. The browser recognizes that and is able to update the page. All of this happens very quickly, usually in a few seconds or less, and then you, the viewer of the website on your mobile device, tablet, or computer, are able to see the updated page. All right, so controllers are responsible for providing the data required in order for a view template to render a response. That means that view templates should not do any business logic or interact with the database directly. So the view template, the HTML file, it's a special file .cshtml that allows us to write C# code inside of it. It shouldn't have any type of logic or anything like that other than just like maybe a for loop or an if statement, you know, some control flow where we are able to do something multiple times, or we're able to hide something or show something based on a specific condition. That sort of thing is just using C# to be able to decide what and how the data that we have available to us in this view is being shown. but it's not actually doing any logic. Okay. So the interaction of the database and the business logic, that's going to happen either in the model layer or in the controller. So a view template should work only with the data that's provided to it by the controller. Maintaining this separation of concerns helps keep the code clean, testable, and maintainable. So currently in our application, we have a welcome method in our Hello World controller class that takes a name and an ID parameter and then outputs the values directly to the browser. We saw that here. That's all it's doing is it's taking in the name and the ID, and then it outputs that as a string or as text. Awesome. So rather than have the controller render this response as a string, we're going to change the controller to use a view template instead. So what they mean there is if you look over in our Hello World controller and you look at this line, this method right here within the controller, this action for welcome, is physically returning this textual string. It pulls in the information from the parameters in the query string, and then it pieces together this text and it sends it back. That's what this return HTML encoder default encode is doing. So we want it to act more like what we have up here on our index. We want it to use a view template. And so that's what we're going to do now. All right, cool. So where was I? Rather than have the controller render this response as a string, blah, 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 the view template generates a dynamic response, which means that appropriate data must be passed from the controller to the view to generate the response. Do this by having the controller put the dynamic data, the parameters from the URL, that the view template needs in a view data dictionary. The view template can then access the dynamic data. So we're going to see that. If that doesn't make any sense, don't worry. We're going to see it firsthand, and I'll point it out to you and show you exactly what's happening. All right, so then in our Hello World controller.cs file, which is in our controllers folder, we're going to change the welcome method to add a message and num times value to the view data dictionary. All right, so the view data dictionary is a dynamic object, which means any type can be used. When we talk about types, we're just talking about like strings, booleans, numbers. If you're not familiar with those, don't worry, I'll kind of highlight them as we're going through it. But essentially, if we see a number, we're talking about something like an int or an integer, if it's a whole number. If we see something inside of quotations, it's usually like alphanumeric special characters all combined together to be like some human readable text. That's a string. Okay, so the view data object has no defined properties until something is added. That means it's just empty, and then we're going to add things to it. So the MVC model binding system automatically maps the named parameters, name and num times from the query string to parameters in the method. The complete Hello World controller is going to look like this. So highlighted in green is what they add. It's just an update to the code that we had previously. You can copy the entire thing if you want to. Go here, just replace what you have. That's probably the easiest route. And then save it. So we keep the index method that returns the view. You'll notice that our welcome here is now returning an IA action result, where previously it was returning a string. Okay. So now it's returning this IA action result, which is the same thing, or sorry, I keep calling it IA action, it's I action result. It's the same thing as the index, right? And it just means that we're returning a view. So then we still have the same parameters here. We're still expecting a name and potentially a num times. If we don't get num times, no big deal, we'll just default it to 1. Then we have this view data thing that's available to us. If we mouse over it, we can see that this comes from Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC View Features View Data Dictionary. And it specifically comes from controller, from the looks of it. So, controller, which by the way, we are inheriting from over here with our Hello World controller. So, looks like we got somebody in here with us, so I'm just gonna update this real quick. Here we go. All right, welcome, and we'll continue. Awesome, so view data dictionary is just this data structure that has key value pairs, and so the keys are what are inside of the square brackets here. Make this a little bit bigger so we can see it better. And then the values that they're mapped to are whatever's on the right-hand side of this equal operator, so this assignment operator. So we're saying, hey, this view data dictionary or object is going to have a key called message, and it's going to point to this string that is prefaced with hello, and then a dynamic string value name that's coming from the URL. And it talked about a moment ago, this MVC model binding system. that's what allows us to have access to name right here. Okay, it's saying, hey, we wrote this action, we expect it to have these parameters coming in from the URL, and so those are going to be brought in from the MVC model binding system and made available to us. At least that's how I understand it. So we're going to concatenate or combine hello space plus whatever the dynamic name is that comes from the query string or from the parameters. And then the view data has another key property here, num times, that's assigned to whatever num times is, either 1 if it's omitted or some dynamic value that gets inputted in the parameters of the URL. Finally, we return the view. Now, if you remember from last week, if we omit an argument to the view method here, then it's going to default to looking for a template by the name of the action that we're inside of. So there's out there in the views directory, there's going to be a folder in this namespace, hello world, that's going to have a file called welcome.cshtml. And it's going to look for that specifically because it's going to use by default the name of the method that we're inside of, welcome. Cool. So here it's just telling us view data dictionary object contains data that will be passed to the view. So anytime we add some data to this view data object by way of this pattern that we just described here, it's actually going to be available to us whenever we get over to that welcome.cshtml file. So we want to create a welcome view template named welcome.cshtml, and we want to put it inside of views hello world. So then we'll create a loop inside of that template that displays hello num times replace the, no, it's not just hello, it's hello plus the name num times. So it's going to loop over the message. Sorry, it's going to loop over num times, whatever that is, either 1 time if it's the default, if it was omitted, or if, let's say we put 3, it'll loop 3 times. And then it's going to print the message, which is hello, and then if there was a name included, it should have the name. So replace the contents of your file with the following. We'll go ahead and copy this. We haven't created the file yet, so let's do that also. So we're going to truncate all this and go to views, hello world. You'll notice we have that index.cshtml. We're going to go ahead and create a new file here, and we're going to call it welcome with a capital W CSHTML. I don't know if it's, what do you call it, case sensitive. You might be able to get away with the lowercase w, but we'll just follow along how they have in the tutorial so we don't experience any unexpected hiccups. All right, so here you can see that this @ sign here is just indicating that whatever is in between the curly brackets is going to be C# code. And it's actually doing something similar to what we're doing in the controller here, where it's saying, hey, I got access to this view data dictionary, and I'm going to go ahead and map a key title to a string value welcome. And you know that the title is used in the layout. So up in your URL, in your browser where you have the tab, the title will now be welcome. And it might be something more dynamic. We could go look at the actual layout to see. Sure enough, it's going to utilize whatever that title is, in this case welcome, but it's also going to say space hyphen space movie space app. So we'll see that in a moment whenever we get over to the browser in our preview. But inside the actual content of the template, we have the H2, which is just our heading with the size of 2, or importance of 2 rather, welcome. And then we've got this unordered list with list items inside of it. It's going to use, again, the @ sign is saying, hey, what comes after this is going to be C# code. So this isn't your typical HTML. This is allowable because we're inside of a CSHTML file, and the framework is going to look at this code and render it out into actual HTML before it gets sent back to the browser where the original request originated from. So here we're saying, hey, this is a for loop. We have this integer variable I that we are initializing to 0 by default. And then we are checking to see if I is less than view data num times. Now there's this int thing here, and then there's this exclamation over here. So the int thing is saying, hey, view data is a string. Sorry, not view data, but num times is potentially a string. We want to make sure that it's a number so that we can do this comparison here of a number I against the num times. So let's cast it, let's convert it into a number before we do that. So that's what this syntax is saying, hey, we're going to convert whatever data type view data is into an integer. and that allows us to compare it against another integer. Is it less than, greater than, is it equal to, what have you. Now the exclamation at the end just means that we are expecting this value that comes back from view data to be not null, okay? And that just is some little fancy thing that we don't really have to worry about, but essentially just means like, hey, ASP.NET, don't throw an error message on us. We are very confident that this is going to actually have a value, so don't get upset with us and throw some type of error message saying, hey, I can't tell if this has a value. We're telling you that we expect it to have a value. And that's all that is. So then the last thing here is that we're going to increment the value of I starting at 0 by 1. That's what the I++ is. We're just saying I, which is 0, is equal to itself 0 plus 1. So 0 plus 1 is 1. Now I is equal to 1. And it's just going to keep doing that until this condition here in the middle is true. So once this expression evaluates to true, meaning that I, maybe it's the opposite, but whenever I is greater than or equal to num times, then it's going to stop the loop. So when this expression evaluates to false, it's the opposite. While it's true, the for loop is going to continue iterating, and this code is going to continue getting printed out or injected into the HTML. So then again, we're just accessing the value of message. And if you go back to the hello world controller, just remember that message is hello, and then if there was a name supplied, it'll do the name. So if we save this, we save that, and we refresh our server, we should be able to go test this. Now let's just double check and make sure that they don't have anything else they want us to do. They're just saying, hey, save your changes, whoop, and browse to the following URL where they have /hello world /welcome question mark name is equal to Rick and num times is equal to 4. Okay, so they haven't actually moved num times into the parameters yet. It's still a query string, which is fine. We'll explain that when we make the change. But anyway, the data is taken from the URL and passed to the controller using the MVC model binder. We talked about this a moment ago. The controller packages the data into a view data dictionary and passes that object to the view. The view then renders the data as HTML to the browser. So this is what we should expect to see if we set the name to Rick and num times to 4. You should see hello Rick 4 times as list items, the little bullet points inside of a unordered list. So if we go over here and we change this to welcome question mark name is equal to Rick and num times is equal to 4, voila, we get this view template, the welcome template that we created, and we get hello Rick dynamically rendered out 4 times. We could change it to 2, we only get 2. We could change it to 20, and we're going to get 20. We can change the name of Rick to Jane, and now we get hello Jane 20 times. So you can see how this is becoming a dynamic application. It's taking input, in this case through the URL from the query strings, and it's doing some logic in our controller, and then it's passing the data that it is built and created by way of an object into that view template, where it then renders the HTML from it and takes that and sends it to the front end, our browser, where we see the output. All right, let's see what's next. So this is just saying, hey, in the preceding sample, the view data dictionary was used to pass data from the controller to a view. Later in the tutorial, a view model is used to pass data from a controller to a view. So currently we're using this object called view data. Then in the future, we're going to use a view model. View model approach to passing data is preferred over the view data dictionary approach. Okay, so basically they're just saying like, hey, as an introduction to these concepts, we're showing you not necessarily the wrong way, but an approach that you probably won't use in practice, at least not for what we're showing you right now. There's a better way, and we'll show you that in a little bit. So let's move on to adding a model, which is the next step in this tutorial. All right, cool. So part 4, add a model to an ASP.NET Core MVC app. So in this article, you can do a lot of stuff. We're going to add a data model class. We're going to add what's called NuGet packages. We're going to scaffold the movie pages. I talked about that earlier, I think, but essentially scaffolding just means that we're going to get a lot of code written for us simply by entering some commands in the CLI, or the command line interface. Okay. So then we're going to do our initial migration. They're talking about the database. So we're going to have some code created for us that tells the database what it's supposed to look like, and then when we run the migration, it actually makes the database update itself. If it's not created yet, it'll create it and it'll update it to make it look like this model that we've created in our code. So we're going to test the app. We're going to talk about dependency injection in the controller, strongly typed models in the app model directive, and additional resources. I think these last three things we're not going to talk about in this video, but we are going to get down to testing the app after the initial migration. So, by the way, if you're here watching live, we got started a little bit late because we had a technical hiccup. So this will be going a little bit longer than the regular 2 o'clock cutoff. 2 o'clock Central Time. So that would be in 15 minutes normally, but we're going to extend past that. All right, cool. So in this tutorial, classes are added for managing movies in a database. These classes are the model part of the MVC, Model View Controller app. These model classes are used with Entity Framework Core, EF Core for short, to work with a database. EF Core is an object relational mapping framework, otherwise known as an ORM. Some people call it an ORM. So that simplifies the framework that simplifies the data access code that you have to write. So basically with an ORM, rather than having to write the queries or the code that interacts directly with the database, we write code in the language of the framework, in this case C# for ASP.NET, and then that behind the scenes writes the actual queries to like a SQL query for a SQL database, or whatever query syntax is used for some NoSQL database. And so basically it's just an abstraction, just makes our lives easier. It can be good for most things, especially because most ORMs give you the option to also write custom queries if you need to. So especially for something like simple CRUD, create, update, destroy operations, we don't need anything fancy. An ORM is going to handle it for us, and having that abstraction is going to be really helpful. So the model classes created are known as POCO classes from plain old CLR objects. POCO classes don't have any dependency on EF Core. They only define the properties of the data to be stored in the database. So in this tutorial, model classes are created first in the EF Core, and EF Core creates the database. All right, so up until now, we've been using Visual Studio Code. If you want this to go a little more smoothly, you might want to try Visual Studio out. I assume it plays more nicely, if that's how you say it, with ASP.NET. That's essentially what it's made for. I'm going to continue with Visual Studio Code. Just know that I ran into a little bug. I'm going to walk you through it if we run into it again. If we don't, I'm just going to like mention it, so at the very least you can know where to go to fix it. But essentially, if you're in Visual Studio Code, there's like extra steps you have to do to set up your configuration. We'll cover it when we get to it, but all that to say, if you're an absolute beginner, it might make more sense to use Visual Studio Code. They've got a free edition, the community edition. You can download it from the Microsoft website. All right, cool. So it's saying, hey, Visual Studio Code instructions are to add a file named movie.cs to the models folder. Let's start there. So we are going to truncate everything, and just like we have controllers and views, we also have a folder called models. And you can see we actually have an error view model.c# or .cs. So inside here, we're going to create one called, I think they want it to be movie.cs. So let me just double check. Movie.cs. So it's a C# file. It always starts with a capital letter. In this case, it's going to be singular. When we're talking about models, we're talking about the naming convention is going to be singular. So this is movie. If you were making posts, it would be post. If you had users, it would be user, and so on. Okay. Cool. So we're going to update the contents of that file with the following code. So you can go ahead and just copy this, and we're going to take this right here and paste it into this newly created file that we have. All right, cool. So this is using something called data annotations, and it's making sure that we're inside of the MVC movie namespace for models. And then it's just creating a public class called movie, which has some different, oh gosh, I don't know what they call them in C#, but we'll just say fields. So they have this public property here, or field, called ID, which is an integer data type. And apparently, just by putting get set in here, it will automatically create getters and setters. If you're not familiar with that, easiest way to describe getting and setting is that First of all, what we're doing here when we create a model, just to kind of zoom out and give you a overview of models, is we're creating a class. So let's talk about it in the context of classes. With object-oriented programming, a class is like a blueprint. So if you know in your code you're going to create lots of, in this case, movies, then you know that every movie is going to have specific properties. It's going to have an ID and a title and a release date and a genre and a price. Each movie will have its own unique values for those, right? It's going to have a specific unique ID. It's going to have a title. It's going to have its own release date, and it's going to vary from the other movies, but they all follow the same blueprint. So that's what a class allows us to do. And getting and setting is just the ability to retrieve the value that's stored for that specific property, or to update it if we want to set it. Maybe it's not set at all yet. It didn't get set when it was initially constructed or initially created, and it needs to be set in the future, or it's been set and it needs to be updated. So this is the architecture that allows us to do that. So we have another one called string with a question mark. I think the question mark in C# means that it's allowed to be null, meaning it's allowed to not have a value. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's what it means. So then we have the ID, the title, the release date. You'll notice the release date is not an int or a string, it is a date time. And above it, you'll see this special syntax that says data type, data type.date. And I believe what that's saying is, even though this is a date time, we're going to use it specifically for the date portion of it. So we don't actually need to include the time, or at least you won't be seeing the time as the output. So the release date is just going to be a day, month, and year for whenever this movie was released, and the time part is not important. So we do use that date time data type, but then we're just using a specific part of it for the date. Meanwhile, we have the genre, which is, again, a string that can be null. I think that's essentially saying that it's optional. And then a price that's decimal. And so, of course, we don't want an integer with a whole value because maybe it's $9.99 instead of just a whole number like 10. So the decimal is going to give us the ability to actually do that. Okay, so let's jump back over here. It's just talking about all the stuff that I just said. And with regards to the data type attribute on the release date, it specifies that the type of the data, date, is such that a user isn't required to enter the time information in the date field. So we'll see that when we actually scaffold everything and we get our forms for creating a movie. And then only the date is displayed, so no time information. All right, so data annotations are covered in a later tutorial, but what we just talked about here is just kind of a very broad overview. All right, so the question mark after the string indicates that the property is nullable. For more information, you can see nullable reference types, but essentially it just means that you can store that value for that property as null, meaning there's no value. It's just a way in programming to say that currently nothing exists for this value. All right, so this is where I ran into some trouble when I was doing it on my own yesterday. When I go to Visual Studio tab, it tells you, hey, you're going to run all these commands. And these commands are going to add the command line interface, CLI tools for EF core, that's the ORM, object relational mapping, and then the ASP.NET code generator scaffolding tool, that's going to allow us to generate a bunch of code based on some CLI commands, and then design time tools for EF core SQLite provider, which installs the EF core package as a dependency, and then packages needed for scaffolding, like the design module from Microsoft Visual Studio Web Code Generation and the SQL Server module from Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Great. You should be able to just copy these, head over to your terminal, and paste them right in. So it'll do one command at a time. And look, here it says that it was successfully installed, and then the green is good, baby. If you don't see green, it may just be because you're in a different terminal than me. You may be using the command line, or you may be using PowerShell. But for me, with the bash terminal git bash on Windows, I was getting green for those. Anyway, I'm seeing a lot of OKs and a lot of green. I'm not seeing anything that's indicative of an error. And then the very last one actually doesn't run until you press enter. Great. So that's how it's supposed to go. But there can be a situation where you run the first command, and I would just test it actually. So first of all, what's happening here is it's uninstalling any existing globally installed version of .NET ASP.NET code generator, and then it installs the newest version. So the first command may say it doesn't exist, and that's fine. Then do the second one to install it. And that's where you might run into a NuGet error saying something like NuGet doesn't have a source or something like that. And that is where I had to do some digging. It took me a few minutes to go on Stack Overflow. I pasted in the error message, and I was able to come up with a solution, which was essentially to run this command .NET NuGet add source and then some URL inside of a string to some JSON configuration and then whatever. So anyway, once I did that, it worked. I'm going to put the link to that Stack Overflow solution into the resources for this lecture. So if you encounter issues where you're seeing a bunch of red text or error messages or whatever, and you can't get past this step, assuming you're using Visual Studio Code, I'm going to direct you over to where you need to go on Stack Overflow to get the correct commands to configure everything. Meanwhile, if you're on Visual Studio Code, all this stuff's built in, baby, so you don't have to worry about it. But for us with Visual Studio Code versus Visual Studio, we do have to install these things manually. All right, cool. It's going to give you some notes here about, what does it say here? The default architecture of .NET binaries to install represents the current running OS architecture. This doesn't matter. This is a more advanced thing. It's not something that you'll need to worry about for this tutorial, so you can ignore that. So anyway, we want to run the build script again with Control F5 on our PC or Command F5 on your Mac, and then we want to go over to the Problems tab on this panel right here and see if there are any issues with the build. So we're going to go ahead and restart. If yours isn't running, just Control F5 to get it up and running. If you have it running in the background somewhere, you need to close it, like if it's in a different tab or something. You either need to use that tab to refresh it or you need to close it, because if you try to run it in two tabs, then you're going to get an error message. This is good. The website came up. That's good. If we click on Problems right here, so we were in Terminal. If we click on Problems and it says no problems have been detected, sigh of relief. That's great. If you're having trouble, you can't get past this point, I'm not sure where you're watching this video. It might be YouTube, might be Udemy, might be DevSprout. Wherever you're interacting with this video, find the comments or find me on Discord, and I'm happy to help you out to make sure you get past this. If you're having issues, don't let it stop you from finishing this tutorial, because it is fixable. Okay. All right. So assuming you didn't have any issues or you've already resolved any issues, then we can go ahead and continue. So the next thing to do is to scaffold the movie pages. So use the scaffolding tool to produce your create, read, update, and delete CRUD pages for the movie model. So here I've got Visual Studio Code selected again, and it wants us to open a command window in the project directory. The project directory is a directory that contains the program.cs and .cs proj files. On Mac OS and Linux, export the scaffold tool path. So you'll want to copy this and paste it into your terminal inside of the main project directory. For anyone else that's just using PC or Windows rather, you just copy this command here. So we're going to talk about what this command does, but you copy it, you go to your terminal, you make sure that you're inside of the folder with the CS proj and the program.cs file. I use the ls command to list all of the files and folders in the current directory where I am with my terminal. Good. Confirmed. We can see that. So I'm going to paste in this command. I'm going to run this command. It's going to scaffold/generate a bunch of code and files for me. And while it does that, we're going to go talk about what the heck this super long command just did. All right. So basically, we have .NET ASP.NET code generator, and it's going to create a movies controller. So inside the controllers directory, it's going to automatically create a file called moviescontroller.cs. It's also going to create the view files for create, delete, details, edit, and index pages inside of the views movies directory. So all three, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those file names are going to be the names of the files with the .cs HTML extension. We can confirm that in a moment. And then it's going to create this thing called a database context class inside of the data directory in a file called MVC movie context.cs. Okay, so all of that happened because of this command. We used the .NET CLI command, we're using the ASP.NET code generator, and we're generating a controller, and we're telling it that the name is movies controller, and then that the model is going to be movie, and then the data context, I believe that's what they call it, is going to be the, yes, the data context is going to be the MVC movie data MVC movie context, and then the relative folder path is going to be the controllers directory, I believe, and this is where the output folder path to create the files is. And then we're saying use default layout, reference script libraries, and database provider is SQLite. So we're setting the default layout should be used for the views, and then we're saying add this underscore validation scripts partial to the edit and create pages. Don't worry about what that does. We'll cover it in a future tutorial, or you'll figure it out eventually. But right now, let's just understand that this big command we just ran just wrote a ton of code for us, and that's great, right? Except that's not how you'll necessarily do it in the future. Like if you're actually a .NET developer, you'll probably code a lot of this yourself, depending on how much it gives you. Sometimes scaffolding can be good if it just gives you enough to like save you time. I don't know the extent of the scaffolding with .NET. In other frameworks like Ruby on Rails, scaffolding is great for like demo purposes, but not necessarily production, because it's just going to give you a bunch of extra files and bloat that you don't need. Again, I don't know if that's the case with ASP.NET, but whatever the case, it just made our lives way easier because it created a bunch of stuff for us and it wrote the code for us in those files without us having to do it ourselves. So, and it created a lot of files. So we'll see that here in a second. Okay. There is an H switch, or what we call a flag, to get help on the ASP.NET code generator controller command. So this is it right here. We'll just copy this to show you that. So assuming everything is finished running up here, which it is for me, I'm going to go ahead and paste this in, .NET ASP.NET -code generator controller -H. And it's just like a little help manual that tells you, you can make it smaller to see everything, but it's just going to tell you all the different stuff, some of which we just talked about. But it's going to say like you can use this flag, this is -P for short, or -- project is the longer flag, and then this is the path to your CS project file and the project, blah blah blah. All this different stuff, it'll allow you to add these flags. Okay, and the -H just stands for help. All right, cool. So with everything installed, now we're going to see if it works. So in addition to creating the movies controller and all of these view files and this MVC movie context, it also updated the database context. It registers a database context in the program.cs file, and it adds a database connection string to the app settings JSON file. The automatic creation of these files and file updates is known as scaffolding. So this whole process is scaffolding. All right, so scaffolded pages can't be used yet because the database doesn't exist. Running the app and selecting the movie app link results in a cannot open database or no such table movie error message. So you can actually verify this. We can go and just refresh our build real quick, and whenever it opens it up in the browser for us, we can click on the movie app link up in the top left corner, and it says the page can't be found. Let's refresh. Well, I mean, that's pretty much it. The other stuff works. I think I got a different error last time, but whatever the case, it's not working. And that's just because we need to continue to migrate the changes from the database over. So we want to use SQLite for development and then SQL Server for production. So SQLite is a super lightweight database similar to MySQL, MySQL, or PostgreSQL, or SQL Server in this case. It's commonly used for development because it's lightweight. It all exists in a single file. It's really easy to just create it really quickly and be able to do everything you need to do in development without connecting to a something like MySQL, which you have to install and configure and create a user for and have permission set up for and all this different stuff, or in this case, SQL Server. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to our program CS file and we're going to change it to where if it detects, it being the application detects that we are in the development environment, which we are when we're working locally, then it's going to use SQLite. However, if it's anything other than development, like staging or production or testing, then it'll use the SQL Server database. Okay, so this is going to be pasted in right below the var builder web application create builder args inside of program CS. Let's go ahead and head over to that file. And this is actually at the very top. So this is the top of the file, and you can paste this in. I'm just overwriting the var builder, it stays the same. And then we have these things here. So it's saying, hey, if the builder environment is development, so this function call, if it returns a Boolean value of true, meaning that we are in development, then the builder services add DB context is going to have this callback function that has some options, and within the options it's going to have this use SQLite, which then it passes builder configuration get connection string for the MVC movie context, the thing that we created in the scaffolding. Otherwise, it's going to do the exact same thing, except it's going to pass in a use SQL Server with the production MVC movie context, as opposed to just the regular MVC movie context. So we'll save this file, and it is yelling at us about this namespace, MVC movie context. It's saying that it can be found. So we'll see what that's all about here in a minute. So the initial migration, we're going to use the EF Core Migrations feature to create the database. Migrations is a set of tools that create and update a database to match the data model. So in Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio for Mac, you're going to run these commands. The .NET EF migrations add initial create. And this is going to create some files. Oh no. So .NET build, some type of error is happening. Let's go to problems over here. So this is the same thing that we saw a moment ago with these highlights here. It's saying that the type or namespace name MVC movie context cannot be found. Are you missing a using directive or an assembly reference? And then some other stuff about the options builder. Cool. All right, so something isn't right. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut down this build. We'll go ahead and just close that. And we go back to this command, and this should have created the MVC movie data MVC movie context for us. So I'm going to run this again. And let's see what happened. Okay, interesting. So we actually got some error messages earlier that we did not see. So let's see what's going on here. I didn't get these yesterday, so it means that something has happened between now and then that the step is not correct. So let's read these errors. This will be a fun little live debugging exercise. So it's saying that the MVC movie context cannot be found. Are you missing a using directive or assembly reference? And it's pointing at the mvcmovie.cs proj. Okay. And then, so this is interesting. This may need to go back to how it was. That was that program.cs. So we'll clear this and we'll run this again, see if it gives us the same error. Okay, interesting. So you may or may not have experienced this. I don't know if my program.cs file had code still in it from yesterday, but whatever the case, when I put it back to what it was defaulted to, everything worked. Okay, now we haven't updated it yet, so let's go ahead and update it. So I'm going to redo. I'm gonna have to go get it from the tutorial. So I'm gonna copy this, go, where am I? Oh, you know what? I might have just actually erased a bunch of stuff on accident. It looks different now than it did before. But anyway, here's this web application create builder args. Here's this web application create builder args. That's where I'm going to paste it in here. And so we keep that, of course, but then we add this if statement here. Now, this is interesting. The builder services add DB context this is happening for development with use SQLite, and then otherwise it's using SQL Server in production. But there's other code that was already here. Okay, and this is actually the error message that we were seeing: connection string MVC movie context not found. This code, even though they don't tell you in the tutorial outright, this is the pre-existing code that this if-else statement actually replaces. So we actually need to remove this and then save this file, okay, and then rerun our build. And let's see if it has any problems. Okay, so the website's back up and running, and if I click on Movie App, now we get the error message that they were telling us we'd probably see, where it's saying there's a SQLite exception, no such table, movie. Okay, great. So now we're ready. I'm going to close that older window. So now we're ready to go back to the tutorial and do our initial migration. Okay, so I'm going to copy this first command for Visual Studio Code, .NET EF migrations add initial create. Go over here. I'm in problems right now. It's telling me it doesn't like this HSTS. I know word. I'm not worried about that. I'm going to go to the terminal and click on my bash terminal. So I have my build open there. That's not where I'm going to run these commands. So I go to bash. This will be bash or PowerShell or command prompt, whatever you're using. And then I'm going to paste in this command, .NET EF migrations add initial create. And if everything goes well, so it starts the build, and then it should generate these files. Oh no. What? Build failed. Use .NET Build to see the errors. It could be because, like I mentioned this earlier, because we had a build running, and I just stopped it with that red stop button earlier. Let's see if this works. So they didn't mention that, but yep, build succeeded. So if you are testing it and you have your application built and you're viewing it in the browser and you need to run the migrations, make sure that your build is turned off. Make sure it's stopped before you try to run .NET EF migrations, because it will try to start a new build and there will be a conflict there, and so it'll cause some issues. All right, cool. So we've added this migration. This is just creating the file that is going to tell it's this description of what the database should look like. And then we're actually going to run the migration here with this new command. So it's .NET EF database update. So we'll go ahead and paste this in and run it. Okay, so this looks positive. You can actually see some like quasi SQLite syntax here. Create table movie has an ID. Remember these properties from our movie.cs. So if we click this, we have the ID, title, release date, genre, and price. And then now if we go back, you can see the ID is an integer. It's not null, constraint, PK, primary key, movie, primary key, auto increment. Don't worry if you don't know what all this means. You'll figure it out eventually. But essentially, we're just creating a table in our database. So like this is our web application, but we are connected to a database, in this case SQLite, in production SQL Server. And we're saying, hey, we have this model, which is like the blueprint for the data that we're going to create or modify or retrieve or even delete. And we need you to store it somewhere. So database over here is like, okay, great, but I need to be in sync with your model. And so your model says you have an ID and a title and a release date and a genre and a price, and they have these various data types, blah, blah, blah. So the migration file is saying these are the commands that need to be run in order to get you to in sync. And then the running of the migration command, the migration file with this .NET EF database update is what actually executes that file and runs those commands in the database, which now gives us this table with these columns, ID, title, release date, genre, and price, that then will allow new rows as we start creating the data into our database. So we'll look at that more closely in a future lecture if we continue the series. But for now, just know that our database is in sync with our model inside of our application. Cool. So this is just going to talk to you about what these commands do, but essentially they create a migration file. The initial create is just the name of the file, so it's just describing what is inside the migration file. So currently we're just initially creating the movie model, but if we were to update it later, maybe add a field or remove a field or modify a field, then we would name it appropriately. So then it's going to have a timestamp, which just makes it unique and lets us know when it was created and has everything in order. Okay, because these, as we create more migrations, they do need to be executed in order, starting from the beginning to the newest one. So then that EF database update command updates the database to the latest migration, which the previous command created. So this command runs the up method inside of our migrations, whatever the file was created. Name is file, which creates the database. So let's actually go look at that. We can go to migrations, and if we drag this out, we can see initial create.cs with the timestamp before it. And if we click on here, we got some C# code, but most importantly, if we go down here, we can see, look at this object-like structure that describes the ID, the title, the release date, and it's got, you know, this table column, integer, this is a string, that's a date time, this is a decimal, type is integer, SQLite auto increment for the annotation on the ID. Down here we've got text, it is nullable, true, these other ones are false, this other one is for genre is true, so that's that question mark we put after the title string and the genre string. Anyway, it's got some constraints for the primary key. If you're not familiar with SQL, don't worry about this stuff. But this file, this is the migration file. This is what gets run and executes the command that actually creates or updates the tables inside of the database. Awesome. So like I said, I think I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, lots of information, right? Lots of things you can drill down into. You can drill down into migrations, you can drill down into the MVC model binding. There's a lot of stuff happening here, but try not to get overwhelmed. Just know that we're using a web framework because we are benefiting from the abstractions that it provides, allowing us to create powerful web applications without having to necessarily know all that stuff. Can you learn more about it as time goes on? Absolutely. Should you? Most likely. But just know that to get started building something, you can just utilize all these commands that we're being taught and not have to worry about the underlying implementation details. All right, so to test our application, we are going to run the app, and then we're going to select the movie app link up at the top, and then we're going to do some CRUD operations using the links and forms that are available to us. Quick note, if you see an exception similar to the following, SQLite exception, SQLite error 1, no such table movie, you may have missed running the .NET EF database update command in the migration steps above, so just make sure that you do that. All right, so this is our application not currently running. Here we are. I'm going to Control F5 to run a build of the application, and then we're going to test it. Okay, so here it is not working. We're going to close that one. It is working, and if we click on Movie App, moment of truth, voila. This is the view file for the index for movies. Remember, movies is the name of the controller, /index is the default. So if you omit it, it just defaults to index. So here we are at the index, and you can't see anything yet. You just see the headers here for what looks like a table. Title, release date, genre, price. So this is a HTML representation of the contents of our database, which is currently empty. But we have a link here, create new. So let's try it out. This takes us to /movies/create. Again, this is another action that was generated for us in our movies controller. So here we have /movies/create. It's a GET request. To our create action, we have the view. The view doesn't have a string argument inside of it, and therefore it's going to default to a template called create.cshtml. So if we go over to our views and we go down to movies And we see here we have create, we have delete, we have details, we have edit, and we have index. You look at create, this is the CSHTML code for the page we were just looking at, and sure enough, here's our form. Okay, so this is the form. We can add a title, hello world. We can do a date with this little date picker here. This can be, it was released today. The genre is going to be comedy, and then the price is going to be $1.99. Notice we're allowed to do those decimals there, and then we click on create. It redirects us back to the movies index. However, before I describe what we're capable of here with this new data, you can see that the movies index has been updated with this new row that contains all this information about the movie that we just created. So the title now has hello world, the release date is in this format of month, year, month, day, year, and then the genre comedy, price $1.99. Now if we click on edit, it takes us to a very similar form, except it says edit instead of create. You'll notice it has this number up here 1 in the URL, and that is the ID of the movie, and that's how we identify which movie it is that we're editing. If we go up here and we say 2, well, we don't have a 2 yet, so we just get this 404. 404 just means that the resource that we just tried to locate doesn't exist. So here we have the stuff. We could say we can update it, put an exclamation there. We could change the release date if we want to. We could say this was released on the 1st. Actually, this is a horror film, and the price is $10.99. And then we save it. All those values get updated. So then if you want to view specific details about this movie, you click on details. And here it is in a slightly different format. Now these are specific to this movie. So we can either go edit this again from the details page. We save it, it'll take us back to the index. Or back here on the details page, we have a link that takes us back to the list, the movies list. All this stuff is generated for us with scaffolding. That's what's great about scaffolding. If you need a CRUD application and you need it quickly, scaffolding is your best friend. So what if we want to delete it? Click delete. It doesn't delete it right away. It takes us to the movies delete /1, 1 being the dynamic value for the ID. In this case, we only have one movie. It starts out with 1. Every new movie after that is 2, 3, 4, 5. Even if you delete one of those, it's still going to increment from the last movie ID that was created. And so here we have this option to delete. And we'll just click on the red delete, and now it officially deletes it. So again, our table's empty. We got redirected after delete back to the movies index. We can create a new one here. And so we can say hello world 2.0, and we can select a date, and we can say this is a comedy again, and then the price is $1.99. Now last thing I want to show you is that when we create another one, and we say, okay, this is Harry Potter, we'll just say Harry Potter 1 because I don't want to type out Sorcerer's Stone, and this was released, well, whenever it was released, obviously not on April 30th, 2024. Genre, I don't know, drama, something like that. I don't know what you, action? Anyway, fantasy? Maybe fantasy. All right, the price, we'll just say it's $9.99 and create it. And sure enough, we get to see Hello World 2.0 and Harry Potter 1. Now you'll notice that the order of these is such that the newer one is on the bottom. And so this is going to be in ascending order. If you wanted to be in descending order, where the newest are at the top, you would have to go edit the query, the ORM code that is retrieving the data from the database. Not going to do that now, but just know that you have full ability to do that sort of thing. So this is the visual representation of the contents of our SQLite database. And we're able to perform full CRUD operations literally with just a couple commands that we got from this tutorial for scaffolding stuff. So super powerful, and this is like scratching the surface. This is, creating a CRUD application is like 101 with any web framework. So there's tons more stuff we can do in the future. If we continue with .NET, which I may, just depending on where things go from here, but we can add all kinds of stuff. We could add users, so that a user is creating movies and they belong to that user. And maybe you can follow other users. It becomes like a social experience. All kinds of stuff you can do. But for now, we have full CRUD, create, read, update, and destroy. You can see the details on the detail page, or what's traditionally in some frameworks called a show page. Here we're on the index, so that these are our two read instances. We can read it here, we can read it there. here being the index, there being the details. We can edit, that's our part of update in CRUD, right? Update is going to be the editing, and when you submit it, then it updates. And then we can create it, so create new, and we can delete it with delete. So that's it. We have full CRUD capabilities for movies in our movie application with our ASP.NET Core MVC application that we created with this tutorial. Now it's going to continue on. So we're going to stop here. I think this is a great stopping point, but the next phase would be to examine the generated database context class and registration. So we're going to stop here. Thanks everybody for watching this video. If you have any comments or questions or concerns, let me know in the comments, and we'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.